Hi there and welcome to Mastering V-Ray Lesson 8, Part 1. Due to the large number of examples and topics covered in this lesson, I've decided to break it into two parts. In Part 1, I'm going to focus on showing you how to create highly realistic ice shaders and scenes based on references I found searching the internet. In Part 2, I'm going to cover how to create some more large-scale scenes such as icebergs. We'll have some snow. I might even cover a little bit of ocean. So I'm just going to try and bulk these topics into the two parts, and hopefully it covers a lot of information you won't have found anywhere else. Now, because the course is becoming quite complex, you're going to have to start paying much closer attention to what I'm doing. I can't guarantee now that the course is getting quite advanced, that I'm going to cover every setting, every button click, things like that that can make a difference to the output of your scene, but that you are subtle enough where you might not realize what you've done wrong. So try and pay close attention to what I'm doing, what I'm clicking, and what values I'm putting in, even though I will explain it. And hopefully by the end of the lesson, you'll have learned stuff that you wouldn't have actually been able to find anywhere else. Now, because each lesson is becoming more complex and much harder to prepare, it's also becoming more difficult to predict how long each lesson is going to take to create. Now, I apologize for the delays, and this lesson is a perfect example of where I've kind of had to go in and re-record and reproduce parts of the lesson because I wasn't happy with the quality. At the end of the day, I'm never going to release a lesson unless I'm personally proud of it and personally happy with what you can achieve learning what's in each lesson. So let's get started, and you'll see that on my Photoshop screen I've got up a few different examples. Now don't freak out too much. On the bottom right here is a photo, and above it is my attempt at recreating that. And even though I haven't got it perfectly exact, the scene does have all the elements there that are visible in this reference shot, just like in all the previous lessons we've done where I've gone in and matched different properties. I'm just going to break this lesson down, explain the different elements that make up the shader, and we can get started with a simple scene like this, and I'll show you how to get all the fog in, show you how to get the reflection glossiness correct, the refraction glossiness correct. On top of that, there's a diffuse component to the shader that you might not realize. And overall, it's quite a complex ice shader. It goes well beyond just a simple kind of watery, glossy, refractive material. These other reference images, I've taken it one step further, and you'll see on the bottom left here, we've got a kind of slab of ice where we've got some fractures and bubbles and things like that being refracted in that. Now, there's a cool little trick I'm going to show you that makes it really easy to create these specialized effects using specific textures you create, and it took me a long time to figure out how to get these results. On the top left here, I've taken it even one step further, and you can see that there's frosting, which I've generated with Forest Pack. Now, if you don't have Forest Pack, you obviously won't be able to follow along through this part of the tutorial. However, as this course progresses, I'm going to highlight the importance of Forest Pack because it is basically the only plugin I use for V-Ray, and it's extremely powerful. And as the course gets more advanced, I'm going to have to start incorporating the use of Forest Pack because sometimes the shaders require more than simple material properties. You need to go beyond that and add, physical geometry that assists in the way the material reflects light and things like that. So let's get started, and we'll start building this first scene up here, and we'll get right into it. So inside of Max, you'll see that the scene is quite simple. We've got the V-Ray dome light, which is the HDR. We've got the directional light here, which is creating the shadow from the ice. If I go back into Photoshop, you'll see behind in our reference image, we've got a small light casting a shadow. That small V-Ray light I've included is doing the same thing. So what's important to realize here when I'm matching this scene is that I don't have much information to try and figure out how the scene is lit. because I can only see one little highlight there, I can assume that there's only one strong light in the scene because of the way the specular highlight is bouncing, and as well as the shadow being cast from that same light. So I get an idea of how that light is built. And then all I did is to light this scene is I altered the size of that light until the shadow was roughly the same. Maybe not exact, but roughly the same. Because that light is going to have an effect on the diffuse component of the shader, which you can see when we zoom in here that there is parts that look a bit dirtier than others. For example, here. And the reason why that's happening is because when this ice has collided with other objects, in the same way I was explaining in lesson 4 about how materials can rub off on each other, in ice you can get things like dust and excess like grime from other surfaces being smudged into the ice. So I'll just drag the material editor over, and you can see the HDR I've used is once again taken from Jorgen, and I've done a slight modification and tone map to that, and also that HDR will be purchasable through my new website eventually, but it is provided in this lesson as a low-res HDR, so you can still use that. So next up, I want to explain that I won't be showing you how to model the ice. However, I have provided all the different ice models in the scene files for you, and I just want to explain, I'll just assign this blend material to the surface. I'll explain kind of what's important when we're looking at this actual piece of ice. So you see here's my render and here's the reference image. If I zoom in and make it full screen, there's a couple of things that are extremely important that you need to realize when modeling that are going to make your material look more realistic. Alright, so firstly, on the outer surface, you've got areas that are quite flat and smooth, and as a result of that, you can see through the ice cube and you can see that it's got a very clear refraction. There's not much blurriness to it. But as we look further into the object, the blurriness becomes stronger and it becomes much harder to see into the material itself. So to replicate that, rather than using a bump map, which is extremely slow to render, I prefer to do it with actual geometry, and then I have control in ZBrush over exactly how detailed or how textured the outer surface needs to be. So basically what I'll do is I'll start with just a straight up box. All I've done is subdivided it in ZBrush and then applied a couple of different large scale alphas, and then I've just smoothed out where I want those to be a bit cleaner. I want the ice to be more visible through the refraction, and I've just got a couple of areas that I've just dinged up with different brushes. I mean, you can do whatever you want really. Each job pitch is going to be slightly different, but one thing that when looking at this reference is that you also have areas that are quite patchy, and you've got little grains sticking out of the surface. So that's what these are for, and that's what they're going to simulate. And basically by doing it in the geometry, you're saving a lot of render time because V-Ray just doesn't handle bump mapping it really well with refractive glossiness. The render times are bad enough as is, and I'll get to that soon, but you're basically going to be looking at extremely large render times when you use bump mapping with this material. Now I have provided the alphas I used in ZBrush to create these bumps, so don't worry, you will be able to recreate very similar to what I've done here quite easily. So you can see here, if I just go back into Photoshop, I'm just going to zoom out, just give me a second, and you can see we've got a few textures here that we're going to be using that I provided. Similar to previous lessons where I've provided different types of textures for scratch metal and stuff, ice is an entirely different shader, it's got an entirely different structure, so I had to go in and create composite textures. And what I mean by that is that all these textures are layered up and they've been very specifically created to match what we're seeing here. So for example, if this was a refraction glossiness map, the white parts are going to be more smooth than the darker parts, and in the darker parts we've got a lot of micro scratches, but in the smooth parts they're kind of wobbly, and you see here we get things that are, even though the surface is bumpy and irregular, it's quite smooth because the ice has melted a little bit more in those areas. Later in the lesson, when we get onto the more popsicle side of things, I've got an even more specific texture I've used, and we'll get to that stuff eventually. But for now, we're going to go back into Max, and we're just going to start creating the shader from scratch. So before setting up any textures, the first thing I'm going to do is just start setting up a very basic ice shader. Now, the first thing I like to do is I bring the diffuse value all the way down to 0, because all I want to focus on is kind of one thing at a time. So I'm not going to turn reflection on yet. I'm just going to turn refraction on to 100%. I'm going to turn the background button on here, so we've got a preview of what we're trying to work with. And I'm just going to set the reflection IOR and the refraction IOR to be what water is, and that's 1.33. You can say ice is 1.31. I'm just going to go a little bit higher anyway, just to make sure that I'm getting enough reflection in the surface. Alright, so with that basic shader created, I'm just going to go in and render it. And I'll just pause the recording for you and start it up when it's done. Actually, let me just cancel that. I'm going to make it much smaller first. So all we're seeing there is just the straight refraction. If I go into the lighting pass, you'll see there's nothing. If I go into the specular pass, there's nothing. The only pass that has visible information is in the refraction pass. So knowing that, we know exactly how well the outer surface of the geometry is with all the detail is affecting the surface. And you can see it's working quite well here. So when you are modeling your geometry, make sure that when you're doing it, you don't go too far with it. Just bring it straight into V-Ray and do some renders just like this with everything simple as possible, so you can see if you are getting the right effect happening. Because what I wanted is I wanted some areas to be really glossy thanks to the outer surface, and I wanted other areas to be really smooth. Now, I wasn't exactly very picky with that. I was just kind of doing it randomly. If I was to match another object exactly, I'd obviously have to pay much closer attention to where I was putting those bumps. But for this lesson, because I'm only explaining how to do it, I can get away with just doing it wherever. But as you can see, we've got a nice effect happening here. So the next thing I want to do is I want to enable the reflection and just see how the material looks now with a bit of reflection enabled also. So now that that's done, if I go into the reflection pass, you can now see that we've got an outer surface also being reflected. And just like the refraction is affected by those outer bumpy surfaces, the reflection is as well. And as you can see here, even though our reflection glossiness is at 1, there are parts, because of those small micro bumps, where it actually appears like we've adjusted the reflection glossiness amount itself. So once again, just explaining the importance of having nice and detailed geometry. And if you are working with different kinds of ice, just once again, just take a really close look at the geometry, because things like this type of bump can be simulated with a bump map because it's so subtle and small. But if you're trying to do things like this, and you're trying to, let me just highlight them for you, things like this, and all this stuff, you won't get a correct result using bump mapping in V-Ray. You can even see on the back edges here that it kind of sticks out of the surface. So either use a really high-res piece of mesh, or feel free to experiment with displacement, but once again, you'll get pretty slow results. Alright, so with that now being created, the next thing we need to move on to is getting the refraction glossiness right. So when I go back into Photoshop and look at this reference image, what you'll see is in the refraction glossiness, you've got some very clear areas where it's got like a kind of subtle transition from blurry to not so blurry. And we're going to try and simulate that using Birkon noise because it does such a nice job of blending between the darkest points and the highest points. Whereas if you use a texture like this, for example, you can see we're going straight from like really bright 1 values to really dark values next to it. And that's not going to create that subtle kind of blurred effect. So what we do to do that is in the refraction glossiness slot, I'm going to make a composite because it is going to require multiple layers, but I'm just going to get started with a single layer. I'm going to plug a Birkon noise into it, and the next thing you want to do is make sure you get the scale right. In this particular scene, a value of between 5 to 10 does a pretty good job. I'm going to set it to 9, and the next thing you'll see is now we've got a kind of noisy refraction. If I go back out to the top surface of the shader, now it's extremely blurry in some parts and not so blurry in other parts. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the refraction subdivs to be 128. I want enough subdivs in there so that both the AA and the materials subdivs are working on this. If I go into the sample rate pass here, you'll see that we've got a lot of areas where all of the anti-aliasing samples are required because there is so much noise, but also in other areas it's quite smooth and we don't need samples in those areas. So this is kind of how I've optimized this particular scene to render the fastest, and it is quite tricky to balance how you sample ice and refractive shaders in V-Ray. It's not as easy as just doing plastic, for example, because we've got so many areas within the shader where we've just got values that are just contrasting each other, and you don't get that with plastics. It's usually a uniform color. So that's the reason why ice is really hard to do. So I'm going to go back into the refraction glossiness, and the next thing I want to do is add a bit of turbulence to this noise, because right now you'll see compared to the real life ice, it's just not messy enough. So in Max, if you add an FBM turbulence, now it totally changes the dynamic of the Birkon noise. And if you remember in the previous lessons where I was saying the levels is simply adding a whole nother layer of this noise and halving the opacity. So if I go to 4, you see we get another layer blended in at half the size and half the opacity. For this particular shader, I'm going to go up to 5 because that's about the limit of where I notice noticeable detail being added. You see if I go to 6 here, it's a very subtle difference between 5 and 6. And at that point, there might just be too much information. So I'm just going to play with the exponent next. And what that's going to do is it's going to control the intensity of the noise that we're putting through the glossiness. So for this, I'm just going to set it to 0.25, and then I'll take a look at how this is affecting our mesh. So you can see now, I'm not going to open that preview because it's a bit too small. Actually, I'll do it, it doesn't matter. You can see now we've got areas that are really quite blurry, and then other areas where it's completely refractive. Similar to what we've got in the ice shader, except the values aren't correct yet. We need to make sure that it's not too dark and too blurry in the blurry areas. So if you go into the refraction now, what we do is we simply raise the color value up. And I'm going to use a value that's quite near to full white, but just a little bit of gray in it. So 230 is what I found produced the best result. So now that we've got that applied, I'm just going to do another render and show you how that's affected things. And let me just get the history up here. And we'll re-render. So I'm in the middle of rendering that, and I'm noticing that it's just a bit too clear still in the ice, and I just want to darken. I want to blur that off a little bit more. So I'm going to cancel this render and make some adjustments to the Burcon noise map we were just creating. So if I enlarge this map, you'll see here that most of it is solid white. Now to affect that, I'm just going to affect the high part of the shader and bring those down a little bit. Now they're just not so dark. I'm just going to make some slight tweaks to the exponent. Now the shader should be a little bit more blurry. And I'm just going to re-render that. But I have a feeling that I'm going to need to add another layer into that refraction that multiplies over the top with a little bit larger scale detail. And that'll give me some larger, more blurry areas. But we'll just render that and just see where this ends up. So we're looking a bit better now, and we can see that there's definitely areas where it's becoming more blurry and less see-through. So let me just save this render and we'll compare the two. And you can see there that changing those values just gives parts of the refraction that blurry value. But in other parts, it's stayed the exact same. For example, down here. So once again, a very subtle change, but ultimately making it a lot closer to what we're seeing here. But like I was saying earlier, we're still not done. I still need to add that second layer into the composite map. So I'm going to go into the refraction glossiness, add a new layer, and then I'm going to drag in this Burcon map into the top coat, and we're going to set it to multiply. So inside the map, I'm just going to darken off a little bit here, the main value, because now we're actually trying to create more crevices in the surface. And I'm just going to make the map bigger because we want larger scale detail. I'm going to try and get some areas that you can see here that are being affected quite strongly to be over a much broader area. So I'm going to nearly double the map. I'm going to make it size 15. And you can see by doing that, we've just made it a little bit bigger. I'm going to change the high to be, see if I go a little bit lower here on the high value, we get more of these white points coming through. And those white areas are going to be unaffected because we've got the map set to multiply. So the only areas that are affected are the darker areas, or the areas that are under a value of 255. Alright, so the next thing we want to do is we want to blend through a bit of distortion into this larger scale bump, because we don't want it to just look like very simple, kind of purling noise. It's very obvious these days for people to spot it, and even though once upon a time when people weren't using procedural maps in their shaders, now with the course being out and it's going to be a lot more common, you need to just take things a little bit further and use distortion to break up that evenness in the noise. So I'm going to go into the distortion slot and add another Burcon noise. I'm going to set the size to 10, and I'm going to keep the low and high just the same because we want an even distribution between black and white. If we don't do that and we get areas that are really bright, what happens is when you use that to bend another map, you get hard edges at those points. So the softer your noise map is that you're using to distort the surface attached to it, the cleaner that distortion will be, and you won't get a kind of unrealistic cracks and crevices and stuff like that occurring. I'm going to use a different type of fractal for this. I'm going to use the hybrid multifractal because that keeps that same intensity that we had without it. So basically, if we add other types of noise, you'll see that that's also one that we could potentially use. But there are some that create these hard lines, and it's those types of noise and fractals that are not going to be as useful. So what we can do is we can now start to distort this. We just drag the intensity up here, you can see the effect that that's having. And now we've just got a bit more of a random surface distribution. I'm just going to adjust the exponent because I'm getting a bit too many white blowouts here. So you can see now if I go up closer to kind of 0.5 around there, when I make this map bigger, we've got some really nice shapes happening. So lastly, I'm just going to take one little look at how I'm multiplying this in, because it's pretty strong at the moment at 100%. So what I can do now is I can just drop that down, maybe go to 50 and see how that affects the surface. So let's take a look and we'll see where we're at. So I'll just show you as this is rendering, you can see that in these areas here, now that we've added in that darkened slot into the composite map, those areas are now much more blurry, and when you blur things more, there's a much higher chance of them picking up highlights from surrounding directions. And what that means is you get areas that appear a little bit brighter and a little bit more detailed than if they were just a very see-through glass type shader. So the end result is it starts looking cold and like this frosting and things like that. So I'll just let the render finish, and at that point, we can now start thinking about how we want to add fog to the surface. So we're starting to get somewhere now that looks something similar to ice. It's starting to look a little bit colder and a little bit more detailed, and it's giving us the appearance of very kind of clean ice. What it is missing though is that inner fog, which is going to create the appearance of kind of light or particles being trapped inside the object. Now you can see in my reference, in my attempt here, I might have gone a little bit too strong with the fog, but I just wanted to exaggerate that just enough so that you could see it was actually there, because in our reference image here, it's not fully apparent if it's fog or a combination of fog and a strong refracted light or something like that. So I've just done my best to kind of highlight how this effect can be achieved, and to do that we'll be using V-Ray translucency. This is why I thought this lesson would be a good takeoff from last week, because we're going to be using some of the same techniques that we learned in the previous lesson. So just before I set up the fog, I'm just going to quickly enable the diffuse component and add a map into the refraction slot. What that's going to do is it's going to give us a little bit more glow and detail in the lighting pass. If we go into the lighting pass right now, you'll see there's still nothing being calculated. So just before I add the fog, I just want to get in a little bit of that color. So I'm just trying to find a value that's kind of like dark and a little bit green, just so we've got a little bit of color added into that diffuse component. Now you can also see, it's a little good thing to know, while I'm editing this, because I have 128 subdivs while working with it, it's behaving quite slow in the material editor. But V-Ray itself still does use a limited number of samples when rendering these material previews. So it's not actually showing you what this material would look like with 128 subdivs. I think it's using a quarter of that. So I think this might be with 32 subdivs. The reason is so that the material editor updates really quickly. But with my workflow that I've been using where we use these high subdiv values, it does end up being quite slow to edit in the material editor. So if you want, while you're making these edits, you can just quickly go to 8, make your changes, and then go back up to 128. It'd be cool if there was a little script for that, but at the moment I just kind of deal with it. So the areas we want to add the color to are the areas where it's more blurry, because those are the areas that are trapping that color. So what we do is we take the refraction glossiness map, which is this composite, and we're going to bring it into the refraction slot. Now the darker bits that are causing those more blurry values are going to serve as a map to control how refractive the surface actually is. So when we go into this top coat, what's happening is, or what's going to happen is, in these dark areas, the V-Ray material is going to refract less light and let more diffuse light in. But at the moment it's really strong, so we just need to make this quite a subtle map, and it needs to kind of be pretty white and kind of and we can use something like that. And now we'll just have a little bit of color added in. I'll just do a region render to show you what I mean. So as you can see in the beauty pass, the diffuse component isn't really noticeable that much. However, if you go to the V-Ray lighting pass, you'll see that it's actually quite a strong, it has quite a strong influence in the scene now. So in the areas where it's more blurry in the refraction, we're getting more particles and more things like dust and stuff getting trapped in the surface. You can feel free to use texture for this if you want. You don't have to use procedurals. I'm only using procedurals because that's what I use for the refraction. But the same thing goes for the refraction also. You don't have to actually use procedural maps for this. I just get the most... well, I just find that because I have to tweak the values so much, it's much easier just to tweak a Burke on noise as opposed to texture in Photoshop. And then right at the end, if I really want to add a little bit of extra detail, I'll then kind of blend in texture similar to what we've got, you know, here over the top. I might multiply that in and just let, you know, very subtly let it affect the maps, giving it that final little bit of detail. But for this stuff, I'm just going to leave it as is for now because I think it's good enough. So now we can finally add the fog. So what we're going to do that is we're going to go into the fog color and we're just going to make it a kind of very light blue, kind of blue-gray material. Oh, blue-gray color, sorry. And we're going to reduce the value. You can see now that that's so strong that the effect it's having is quite huge. So I'm going to reduce that to 0.02. And you can, the higher you go with this fog value, the more this kind of effect that you see in the center here will come through, and the thicker and more solid the ice will look. If you use a very high value, say like 0.08 for example, it'll start looking a little bit more like dry ice. So now you can see it's a lot more subtle. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to enable hybrid translucency. In the backside color, we just want to drop that value a little bit. Maybe just a little bit brighter. We're going to set the scatter coefficient to 0.2. The forwards and backwards coefficient to 0.05. And we're going to make the light multiplier 2. You can see adding that extra bit of multiplier to the light just makes it go a little bit brighter, giving it that appearance that it does have a little bit of glow inside, like you're seeing some kind of light being refracted or trapped or something like that. You don't want it to be very dull. You do want the effect to be quite bright, even if it's in small areas. Alright, lastly, I just want to put the fog bias to minus 0.1. That's just going to move the fog a little bit more towards the corners and crevices. And we can take a look at how this is handling. And now that I know kind of how the refraction map's working, I'm just going to go really lower on the color threshold, and that will make things render a lot faster. So you can see that the sensitivity of the fog color is actually quite strong, and I've got too much saturation in it, giving it this very blue tinted appearance, which takes it away from that ice look. So I'm just going to cancel the render, and I'm going to go into the fog color and just adjust that until it looks a little bit more gray. Might need just a bit more red. Another thing I'm going to check is the backside color, and I'm just going to go a little bit brighter on that. And we can re-render now. So once again, it's still just a little bit too blue. So I'm going to go to the fog color and just minimize that just a little bit more. And we'll see how that looks. I'm also just going to increase the sampling on the anti-aliasing just a little bit so that it becomes a little bit clearer and we get to see what the fog looks like when it's a bit more smooth. So while I've been rendering this, I've decided, and you'll often realize this while you're working on a job and while you're at work, that sometimes you just do a test render and it looks really good. Now, what I've seen some people do is they just wait for their test renders to finish and then decide, but a lot of the time you're going to get a lot of benefit out of just constantly checking your test renders to make sure that if you do see something good, it is sometimes more beneficial to go to a higher resolution just to make sure that it still holds up. Because remember, as a print artist, rendering something 400 pixels wide is a whole world apart from rendering it, say, 4,000 pixels wide. So remember at all times that just because something's working at low res doesn't mean it's going to work at high res. Now I think I've seen enough here in this test render to go to a higher resolution, and with a little bit of editing in Photoshop with some brightness and adjusting, we can end up making it look a bit closer to the reference image. So I'm just going to go up to 1100 wide and going to re-render, turn off the region rendering, and we'll see how it looks. This render is probably going to take about 30 minutes. So as predicted, the render times aren't great, and I'm not trying to say they are good. However, I'm just trying to show you guys the best way I know how to create these types of advanced eye shaders. Now, I mean, sometimes on some jobs, you know, you kind of just get stuck in a situation where it's just like, you know, look, the render times are going to be huge and we just need to deal with it. There's no way around it. And usually if you go to your boss and you just let him know that that's what it's going to take, or let her know what that's going to take, then they'll be pretty understanding. But if you leave it until the end of the job and tell them, then it's going to cause a lot of problems. So if you notice that your renders are extremely long, even at low resolutions at the start of the job, just let your boss know what's going on and how long each render is going to take, and always give yourself a little bit of extra time there, because rarely do renders come out looking better than we wanted. It's always some problem or another that we have to fix. So I've had the ice rendering for about 10 minutes now, and it's looking really good. I'm really happy with it. I'm happy with how the fog's turning out. I think it looks a little bit better while I've been recording it, as opposed to the previous attempt where it was a bit strong. Now it's going to come out looking a little bit closer. But one thing that I am missing here is the reflection glossiness. So if we go to the reflection pass, now that it's really high res, I'm just noticing that it's just too shiny everywhere, and we need to adjust that. Now technically I could use the same map